Hello, and welcome to episode 132, the Power Score LSAT podcast. This is John Denning down in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
Oh, we didn't get a weather report today. That means it's
Sunny.
nothing exciting.
I don't always give the weather. It's the rainy season's over. The sun is now coming out, and it'll be consistently sunny and will not rain here for at least 5 or 6 months now.
Interesting.
And I'm not kidding, no rain at all. It typically won't rain at all in a 6-month period, which is kind of wild if you think about it. It's also why we have fire issues eventually.
Yeah, dry for 6 months is no good. We are creeping into this weird period, and you know this about Southern California, called June gloom. For anyone who's never seen it, you think California is sunny all summer long. Not so much, at least not in pockets of it. Where I live, June is a pretty dreary month. June's kind of an indoor drinker's month.
We're sad for you, John, down in lovely Los Angeles.
I mean, I got it real tough in Beverly Hills here. When the skies go gray, it's like, what's the point?
Well, if skies are gray in Los Angeles, what are you drinking today?
I've gone back, in fact, way before my LA days. This probably takes me back to college. We're going to talk about the U.S. News today released 2024 law school rankings. And I had rankings on my mind, and I was kind of having a little bit of an itch for whiskey or bourbon. And I was like, I wonder what the best-selling bourbon or whiskey in America is. And the closest or best stats that I could find were for 2022, and it's actually a bourbon or a whiskey that I like quite a bit, which is Maker's Mark. So,
telling me Maker's is the best-selling bourbon in the U.S.
What Google told me. So I'm just reporting what I've read. But yeah, Maker's outsold Jack. It outsold... I was really worried it was going to be something terrible like Jim Beam. I was like, God, I'll have to drink it. Thankfully, Maker's.
You just offended a huge swath of listeners. Jim Beam's terrible? What?
Fine by me. I'll happily offend them. But I took the first few sips and I was like, this could go wrong. I haven't eaten much today. So I splashed some Diet Coke in there to hopefully mellow it out.
Good.
College
drink,
you
should be splashing in there.
College drink, whiskey and Coke.
Good for you. Well, I went back much further than that. I went back to a drink my parents used to have that I would imagine the majority of people listening to this have never heard of. It's called a Harvey Wallbanger. And it really appealed to me, because I just saw it recently, and also with rankings, I think some schools are really going to be banging on the wall after this. Some with joy and many with sorrow. But a Harvey Wallbanger is essentially a screwdriver. So it's just orange juice and vodka with one key addition. If you've ever been to a bar and you see that really tall bottle that's almost like a pyramid shape, but it's really like 2 or 3 feet tall and it's full of yellow liqueur, that's Galliano. That gets added to this drink and it changes the flavor, I think, significantly. It's got very vanilla kind of flavor. So it doesn't taste like a screwdriver, at least the way you traditionally think of it.
Yeah, I was going to ask if it was lemon or citrus or something.
Yeah, it's more vanillin is kind of the way I think about that flavoring. I'm not always the best at identifying it, but it does change it so it's not just, I don't really like a screwdriver all that much. This is much better. But my parents used to drink this, so I'm like, yeah, it's old school.
A Harvey Wallbanger. Good for you. We both went old school, although you clearly dipped a little deeper back. You also picked the song for today, so once again, I'll just tee that one up for you.
Absolutely. One of my favorite artists, although not one of your favorite artists.
Nope.
But we know that the U.S. News and World Report rankings this year are all about change. And so it's David Bowie, and the song is Changes. John, it's time to turn and face the change. So let's move forward.
Let's do it. LSAT World? Or did you mean my non-appreciation of David Bowie? Which change are you looking to make?
We're not going
Okay,
into
good.
Your lack of appreciation for Bowie continues to mystify and confound me, so we're not even going to address it further. We've talked about it previously. I still don't understand it.
I'm a man of many layers. Let's talk about the LSAT World.
Or few, one of the two.
Bowie's not a layer. Let's talk about the LSAT World. The next thing we have coming up, obviously, something that's been on both of our minds and lips all week, is the June LSAT. This starts on Friday, June 9th, and we'll run through Saturday, June 10th, with a little spillover into the following week, the 13th or so, whatever that Tuesday is, where people with accommodations will test. The score release comes about 3 weeks later, towards the end of the month. June 28th is where you'll get that score. And the reason I say it's been on our minds and lips this week, Dave, is because you and I ran a Crystal Ball Revisited, or as I think the name is now, kind of won the day, a mini ball.
Mini ball.
Mini ball.
Yes.
On Tuesday night for people, where we went back and we looked specifically at the April and June test predictions that we had made back in March to apply to both of these tests, completely reevaluated everything on the heels in the light of the April results, what we saw there, and then made one entirely focused on and targeted to June only. So for those of you who were able to join us Tuesday night, you'll know what I was talking about. For those of you who missed it Tuesday night, that's a shame, but if you were a PowerScore student, you still have access to this. And I strongly encourage you to take advantage of that. It is in all of our student centers. We have updated all of the recommended problem sets. We have changed the recommended topics and things to look for in games and reading comp. There is a lot of information in that is going to apply to June and that is going to help you. So if you missed it, it's not too late, but please do take advantage.
Yeah, and when we say PowerScore students, we mean PowerScore course students, tutoring students, or analytics students. You have to have the special login into the online student centers. That recording is there. The problem sets are there. If you're not, it's definitely worth it to become a PowerScore student and to access that information. And this June test is looking really interesting. Right now, it's got the highest count of the year. The current registration on that exam is 27,484, which is a really big registration number. Now, as I've actually been talking with some of our colleagues here, John, that number is going to melt down. It's going to probably melt down closer to 20,000 when it is all said and done. But this calendar year is showing more students taking the LSAT than last year. Just as a comparison, it's about even this year up until the June test. Last year, the June test had 16,000 test takers. Here, we're going to have at least 4,000 more than that, I would say, when the final number comes out. So we're looking at more applicants, at least from an evaluation at this point. Still have to see how the summer actually goes, but that is probably going to create more competition going forward. Obviously, that affects the kind of like yields, the ratios of people getting in and so forth. So something we'll keep on watching as we move forward.
Yeah, we've talked about the utility of this June test as well. One of the talking points in a recent episode that we just did, it might have been the very last one, where we were talking about scholarship reconsideration and how to engage with schools to potentially change your standing in terms of financial aid, and how useful a test like even June, as late as it is, can be, because that can be an improvement in your credentials enough to move the needle in your favor. They can give you a little more money, or at least charge you a little less. It's probably a more accurate way to say it. So, yeah, there's a lot of value to June, and as slow as this cycle seems to be going, man, it is no surprise that a lot of people are still just hovering around June as something of a last resort that they're really hoping not to have to rely on. That's my guess. And I think that's where those 7,000 people are going to fall off.
Yeah, some people use June to get in off the wait list. Some of them use to get that reconsideration. And just as a kind of like a reference on that, I was talking to a dean of a law school, a former dean of a law school earlier today, who actually listened to that reconsideration episode and had some really nice comments.
That's cool.
Saying, especially about the tonality and how to approach the law schools, that we were spot on with that, which we'd talked to a bunch of deans admission before that, so we knew we were in the ballpark with it. But it's always nice to get kind of like confirmatory evidence after it's published and out there. But if you're taking that June LSAT and you're looking to see how PowerScore actually approaches the exam, we've got a couple of free webinars coming up. There's one coming up on May 23rd that is primarily about logical reasoning and common flaws that you see in logical reasoning. Then on June 6th, we've got a logic games webinar that covers templates, one of the concepts that comes up on every LSAT and I think is absolutely critical to understanding. There's another one on June 20th about parallel reasoning in logical reasoning, covering those types of questions, a really cool webinar. And then another one on July 5th, right after July 4th there, about reading comprehension and comparative reading passages. And there are others that continue on through July and August, and those are free to you. It gives you a preview of what we do, and it teaches you something about the LSAT as well. You can sign up for those for free at powerscore.com/free seminars. And occasionally you see John in there, occasionally you see myself in there. We just did the mini ball, so I'm not sure what the next time we'll be on the microphone in a free webinar, but definitely drop by. We have our ACE instructors running those. They're really useful.
Yeah, I think I've paid my May dues. We'll see what happens in June.
Yeah, this is it for May. do another podcast probably in a bit. But between the mini ball and starting off this, I feel like the first 11 days of May, we've done the yeoman's work that was needed.
Yeah,
and on that note, then, John, let's talk about the newly released 2024 U.S. News Law School rankings. And the first thing I'll note is they're called the 2024 rankings. So it's 2023, 2024. And I hate that because they're really trying to look forward. But I hate it when it's released in one year and they call it the next year. So that's my first quibble of many today. And I'm just going to cover a little bit of the discussion of some of the methodology. I've been studying this closely, and we're not going to get too deeply into it, but there's some comments that are worth making. And the first one is that U.S. News has changed the methodology on this more than once during this process, and this has probably been the most fraught process that I've seen from them. Usually these release at the end of March. Maybe April 1st at the latest. Here we are in the early to middle part of May, and we're finally getting them. They posted preliminary rankings, pulled those down, then reposted them, put up a methodology, changed that. Apparently there were errors in the data, among other things. This has been a real shoot yourself in the foot kind of exercise by U.S. News. Or an excellent kind of example of burning your brand to the ground, depending on how you want to look at it.
There have been a lot of false starts, that's for sure.
And absolutely terrible by them. And really, they tried to be transparent with their article, but they're so presumptuous, I think, sometimes in the way they speak about things, as if there's some kind of all-knowing authority that every time I read communications from them, it hits me the wrong way. So that view is going to inform a lot of what is said. Usually, when we have done this in the past, we've gone through the methodology in a point-by-point breakdown, and I think we're going to avoid doing that this year. We're going to make a few comments. I saw some great articles online today that kind of covered some of the methodological changes and the impacts of this. One was by Donald Tobin on the Paul Caron's blog, and the other one was by Derek Muller. These are people who are law school deans, former deans, law professors still at this point, who actually understand the process, have a lot of really interesting things to say. I'd really urge checking those out. Our friends over at Spivey Consulting, who we wrote the Law School Admissions Bible with, they've had a number of excellent comments. I talked to Mike earlier today about this even. But what I would say about the methodology changes is they are significant. And there's really two things that come out the most to me. The first is that outcomes from law school coming out are really important. All right, so when we look at that, that means they now make up over half the ranking metric. There's a greater emphasis on bar passage. It was previously 3% of the rankings. It's now 25%. And there's a greater emphasis on employment numbers, which are about 33%. And I think this is great. We want to see that people coming out of law school are actually succeeding. So I think the focus on outcome is important. I know the people at Above the Law who have a very outcome-oriented ranking are probably raising their hands saying, welcome to the party, pal. A little diehard reference there. You're finally joining us on the journey here of understanding that outcomes are really important. But what that means is that as much as outcomes have really been juiced up, input numbers have become less important. The LSAT is one of those numbers. It used to be 11.25% of the rankings. It's now down to 5%. And GPA used to be 8.75%. It's now down to 4%. So collectively, LSAT and GPA was 20%, and now it is down to 10%. I will say that people have said, well, is that going to affect merit scholarships? I think it could a little bit. But at the same time, LSAT and GPA are still something that the law schools can control really well. They're very widely separated and gradated. So schools are still going to emphasize these elements. When I was talking to Mike Spivey, he was like, look, budgets aren't going to change very fast. There's a glacial change of pace in the law field. And the schools are also aware of the fact that the metrics could change back next year. So they can't just ditch one metric entirely in favor of another, because next year you could see a completely different set of rankings coming out. So his thinking is that it really won't affect merit scholarships all that much. And that even if this were to stay this way, LSAT and GPA are solid differentiators. And so even being less emphasized, they would still be important because the rankings are so compressed now. This is something that you've seen people talk about, that there's more volatility and more compression, and we certainly see that in some of the results that we have down here. So
Yeah,
Sounds scary.
I was going to interject
Good.
something earlier, but now I wonder if I maybe don't need to. You use the word methodology a bunch, and I was just going to explain to the layman out there who maybe has never even heard of this before what methodology really means, and it's the overall algorithm or formula that U.S. News uses. All of the different criteria that they're essentially trying to measure and rank when they tally up total sort of raw scores, basically, for these schools that then determine where they put the schools on the list. So when we talk about things like bar passage, that changed in terms of how much weight or emphasis they gave it, and that changed where schools would then fall on the list of ranking based on what their bar passage rate was. Ditto things like employment and LSAT and GPA, as Dave just explained. I think the context of you explaining it probably was enough to clarify that. But it occurred to me at the beginning of that discussion, Dave, again, sorry to just cut you off, that there might be some people who are like, what methodology is he talking about? It's how the rankings themselves get formulated.
Yeah, and methodology is a classy word for formula here.
Yeah.
It's just a big mathematical formula. They punch everything in, and then it says, these are your schools. And some of the online studies today are showing how much more compressed it is than it used to be. It used to be more widely separated. Now with this compression, even small changes in some of these numbers can have a big impact. And some of them, like peer reputation, have become less important as outcomes became more important. But peer reputation was so stable for so long that lowering that makes the rankings more volatile. And there's random stuff in there too, like the library metric. Yes, there is one. Last year was 1% weighting. Now it's 2%. And that library metric is based upon the number of full-time librarians to the student population. And you think about something like that, you know that there's a dean out there somewhere at a law school who's like, time to hire more librarians.
Yep.
Maybe I'll have them teach some classes on legal research and add them to the payroll that way. Or maybe I'll have a regular librarian move over to our payroll so that we can juice the numbers. All of this, all these numbers seem like they're so arbitrary, or they're so factual, but in many instances, they are a bit arbitrary, certainly chosen by U.S. News, but even the way schools interpret what the meaning is in the past has been controversial. So I would recommend that everybody take a very close look at the methodology to understand it, because this is just U.S. News's valuation. Their formula values what it values. It's not some kind of overall holy grail. It's not some kind of perfect formula. I could make a totally different set of rankings just by switching around the weightings. And quite honestly, one of the things we know is
tempting.
Well, we know that U.S. News did that.
Yeah.
They would not commit to having the ranking weights released before they saw how they affected the outcomes. And I have said in a prior podcast, John, that is bad science. That means that it is subject to being rigged a little bit to make sure that it's kind of close to what they had before. I think they really wanted to keep the T14. Otherwise, they would have been subject to massive criticism. They still will be, because we're here to do that. But ultimately, this is U.S. News's look at it. You could have a completely different set of values and they would be just as viable, because these really aren't valid in any kind of given way. One other change, though, John, is usually they went up to like 128 schools ranked, and then they took all the other schools and lumped them together. This time they have gone up to 180 schools, which just makes me laugh, because seriously, do they know which school is 159 and then that school is 160? I'm not buying that. But now just the last 16 are grouped, and we think maybe they did that to try to stretch out the scaling and the comparison, because they put it on like a 1 to 100 scale. So that's kind of some methodology points. Just keep that in mind, though, as you hear about how much a school rose or fell. What does it really mean? Not a whole lot. It's just that's the way the numbers fell out. They could change next year, and they will change next year. They use the same system. It'll still be a lot of volatility to it because of the way it's set up.
Yeah, I'll add one more point. This is kind of a personal one, which is this. When I see that critical pieces here, within this overall formula or methodology that they're using can change this much from one year to the next, what this tells me is there's such a degree of like arbitrariness to this, a degree of almost like, let's let our desired results determine the experiment that we run, which is what you were, I think, referring to before. Like, let's make sure that the pieces line up as an outcome and then think about how to get them there. Okay, well, then we need to adjust this. We need to adjust this. Not because it's the right thing to do, but because it gives us what we want. That is bad science. That is certainly bad statistics. So when I look at this and I see that, say, bar passage is up about 25% from what, 3%?
3 to 25%. Yes, exactly.
From one year to the next. Either it just dawned on them that this is now one of the most important factors of all that has hardly been even considered for decades, or they're playing games here for, almost capricious reasons.
Yeah, overall, the real message that we're trying to give out here is this looks really decisive. School number 1, school number 10, school 25. But it is anything but decisive. It is very much arbitrary. It reminds me a little bit of the NCAA tournament rankings in basketball. Here's the 1 seed, here's the 2 seed, here's the 3 seed. But as we have seen, 16 seeds can beat 1 seeds. And in that same way, the 16th ranked school might be better for you than the first ranked school. So take it with a grain of salt. It's always an interesting exercise. I think Americans in particular love rankings.
Sure.
I just want to put somebody first, second, third. It seems very culturally to be the way that we are. So keep that in mind. And remember that some of the stuff that they're measuring, like the reputation metric or the library metric, there's so much uncertainty within that. It's very subjective at times. It's prone to being gamed. The whole thing is undermined by that. That said, John, let's get into it and talk about what we actually saw, which is really the fun part, to do the broad strokes and then kind of work through the winners and losers.
Fair enough. Yeah, I was just thinking you and I could sit here all day and talk about how almost silly this is. I think it's a little silly. In fact, I get a little bit, if I'm honest, I get a little annoyed when we have to do this episode each year because I'm like, I have to treat this as more serious than it is, and I hope people don't take it as seriously as it could be taken.
Indeed.
So there we are.
We've made the disclaimers. We're happy with it. I think everybody knows that we think U.S. news sucks. Just to put a fine point on it.
All right. I thought I was taking shots at him, but go for it.
Nah, I'm in a mood. I've heard Bob Moore speak before. I've watched them in the last year. Whatever respect I had left is gone at this point. So that said, we're still talking about them, so they get what they want in the final analysis of it.
Yeah.
Let's start off with the top schools, what is traditionally called the T14. And one of the questions we often get, especially from students new to the whole law school application process, is why is there a T14? That's such a random thing when you say T15 or T20. The T14 actually refers to the schools that have traditionally been the top 14 schools in the U.S. News rankings. For a long time, it was the same 14 schools. And that included all the typical schools like Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Michigan, Duke, Cornell, all these kinds of schools. And then in the last few years, we've had a little bit of movement at the 14th position. Georgetown has, on several occasions, continued to hold that 14th spot, and then every once in a while they lose it to UCLA. Other than that volatility, it's always been the same 14 schools with Georgetown in there. So that when we talk about the T14, these are considered, by many students, the most desirable schools that are out there. They often have the best employment outcomes in terms of the so-called highly desirable jobs like big law or federal clerkships, what have you. So we start at the top and then we'll work our way down a little bit. Let's talk about some of the specific changes in the T14 here. Stanford has now moved up to tie Yale for number 1. Yale has always been the number 1 school here, and here comes Stanford tying it up with them. And this is when I look at it and I think about engineered outcomes, because if Yale had suddenly dropped to 4th, you can imagine the clamor over these rankings are bogus. Right. So they had a vested interest in making sure that Yale remained number 1. And I think in a lot of respects, Yale is, for many students, the top school. Penn, another school, has some victories today. Heard from one of our admissions consultants who is a Penn student who was like, good day to be a student here, because they have moved from 6 up to 4. Harvard continues its fall. Last year they dropped. Now they're down to number 5, which is okay. Sure. I'm not buying that Harvard is the 5th school. In reputation, they're right up there with Yale, probably 2nd.
You got to think there's some unhappy people in Boston today, though. Whether students or faculty, you got to think there's some people at Harvard, like, if not, maybe unhappy is too strong a word, but I imagine eyes rolled pretty hard. There's emergency room visits for rolled eyes that got stuck.
Um, I don't think unhappy is too hard. I would imagine there's just massive irritation, like for real. Harvard's now behind Penn, and that's not a knock on Penn. It's just like, look, Harvard and Yale are considered like the two blue bloods of American education. They're the Oxford and Cambridge of what we have over here. So to suddenly see them drop down when Harvard has traditionally been, a top 2 or top 3 school in the law school rankings, now they're 5th. They are 5th, though, with NYU, who's jumped back up, and Duke, who made a big leap, as we'll talk about a little bit later. So instead of it, you used to have what's known as the T6, which is Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and then Columbia, Chicago, and NYU. Now Duke jumps in there along with Penn to kind of like make up a 7 here. Columbia drops from 4 spots to number 8, which is what? All right, now all of a sudden they've traditionally always been up there, and now they're down. UVA stuck itself at number 8. Berkeley dropped 1 to 9. Northwestern jumped up a couple to number 10. Michigan stayed at number 10. There was a lot of ties this year. Cornell dropped to 13, and then UCLA and Georgetown flipped again. So this year, UCLA is number 14, and Georgetown is now number 15.
Yeah, one quick correction on that. Berkeley, I think, dropped to number 10. Alongside, Northwestern. You said 9. I think Berkeley's now 10.
I was thinking about what they were last year, John.
Yes, they dropped from 9 to 10. Easy to do.
That was just probably a straight misstatement.
Anyway, just a quick correction. Keep going.
Yeah, let's look at some of the biggest moves in the T25 then, too. USC moved up 4 spots to number 16, along with Minnesota, who moved up 5 spots to tie at 16. Yeah, UGA, your home state, John, down in Georgia, up 9 spots from 29 to 20. WashU was the big loser in the top 20 there. They were down 4 spots to 20th position. Wake Forest jumped up 14 to number 22. So all of a sudden they went from 36 to 22 in 1 year. What are they doing at Wake Forest that suddenly caused that massive jump? Again, nothing. It's just the way the measurements changed that benefited Wake this year. And then Ohio State also benefited, up 8 spots to number 22. And these schools are now in the T25.
Yeah, man. I can tell you, I've got a tutoring student that I helped out last year she's undergrad at UGA. She wanted to stay at UGA. She didn't think she had the numbers for it, but we worked and we got her there, and she got in. And of course, in her head the whole time, she's thinking, yeah, but it's still like barely top 30. I can't wait to get a text from her at some point in the next day or two when she sees this to be like, I'm going to a top 20 school all of a sudden.
The problem is next year it might be to 30 again.
Okay,
depending on what they do with the rankings.
I'm not going to burst the bubble, but for
those of you celebrating at various schools or various acceptances, enjoy it. Just realize it could change. And those of you who are, drowning your sorrows today over the big drops that some schools experience, that could change next year too. Oklahoma being a great example that we'll cover a little bit later. Huge drop last year, huge leap this year.
Yeah, and you got to feel bad for those poor Harvard folks, man.
No, I don't feel bad for the poor Harvard folks. They're at Harvard. They'll be fine. Let's talk about some of the moves in the top 50 just really quickly, some of the larger ones. You had Boston University, bad day for them, down 10 spots to number 27. So they fell out of the top 20 and out of the top 25. And their crosstown rivals, Boston College, jumped up 8 to number 29. So those two schools are very close proximity, both physically and now in the rankings. Fordham jumped up 8 spots to 29, and a school that places extremely well in New York City and Big Law up in that area, and really less known outside New York. You come out to San Francisco or LA, it's not as well known of a school, but in New York really, really does well. Texas A&M, a school that we're familiar with, very much so, up 17 spots to the 29th position, which I know makes the folks down in College Station quite happy.
That's the biggest jump I think we've seen to this point too. That's
up to this point, yeah,
17-point increase. Oof.
You had Wake up 14 and now A&M up 17. But notice that this is in the top 50 and you have double-digit jumps. Yeah. From a percentage standpoint, that's a really huge jump. That shows you the nature of the volatility and the movement and really the compression. One small change in a metric that might not appear to be that important can have a really big impact. One of the things that someone said to me earlier today was that they'd been looking at various metrics, and there's one they hadn't really paid a whole lot of attention to, and they realized that they were getting penalized more than the weighting would suggest because everyone else, all the other law schools, had really similar numbers, and theirs was out of kilter. And when they changed that and addressed that problem, their ranking actually jumped up a lot more than you would expect from just a couple percentage points of a weighted measure because they became closer to the other schools out there. So little changes can have a really big kind of impact. Couple schools that didn't have such a great day. Alabama down 10 spots to 35. GW down 10 spots to 35. That doesn't make too many people happy there. Emory, another Georgia school, down 5 to 30. Iowa dropped, another school that has traditionally been viewed as a top 25 school, and sometimes higher than that, down to 35. Illinois down 8 to 43. So not such a great day for some of the Big Ten schools like Iowa and Illinois, but then Minnesota and Ohio State had great days. Yeah. So can't even look at it from a conference standpoint. We got a couple risers. You had Villanova up 13 to 43. Pepperdine up 7 into the top 50 at 45. SMU jumped 13 to 45. Another big loser was William and Mary, dropped 15 spots to 45. So they went from 30. Yeah. Really respectable. Now they're 45th, and it's like that's you start to feel like you're getting lost in the shuffle. And then Baylor jumped into the top 50, going up 9 spots to number 49. The first thing you notice, though, John, when we run through all those numbers, if you compare it to last year, the number of double-digit and more than 5-spot movements is significant, much more than it was last year. If you were to go back and listen to the podcast we did last year, because we do one of these rankings, winners and losers every year, you'd notice that the gains weren't as much and there weren't nearly as great of a volume of change. These schools are all over the place. We could keep on with it, but I think we'll stop there. The top 50 covering a lot of schools that I think many people are focused on, but you can see that these schools are up 5, up 7, down 8, down 11. Every school, for the most part, is moving around a little bit here, and some of them are moving on quite a bit.
Yeah, it feels a lot more this year. Instead of just like moving pieces on the board, it feels like somebody just flipped the table. Pieces landed where they landed. There's just this scattered effect of like, hey, Villanova, what do you think? You were 56. How about 43? Hey, William and Mary, 30? Sucks to be you. Now you're 45. I mean, this is just, it's rough. There is some rhyme and reason behind it, of course, because they do at least release portions of the algorithm, the methodology, as you called it earlier. But for some of these schools, I mean, there has to be a bit of heartbreak here. For other schools, there has to be a sense of almost like a shocking accomplishment.
One of the things that really concerns me is that, people can lose jobs over things like this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Huge drop. And it's like, well, I didn't do anything. They just changed it. It's like, well, now you better fix it fast or we're going to have a problem. And that is very much like the U.S. News. If you've ever seen that movie, Wreck-It Ralph, that's what they remind me of right now, just wrecking the building. And some people are going to be like, I need Fix-It Felix in there fast. You can tell I have a 10-year-old.
Yeah, these are lost on me, but I'll take it.
That's a good movie, actually. I've only seen it about 30 times, so would recommend it, though. It's at least easy to rewatch.
You're right, though, that these have consequences. These are real world things that are happening. And as much as we can downplay them in terms of how you should treat them as a student, there's probably somebody at Alabama worried about filling out a resume right now.
Or they're calling someone to say, we need assistance. We need to look at how this is working for or against us, depending upon the school. In a place like Alabama, they're like, we have to make moves. So there will be changes behind the scene with this, and that's just something to be aware of as an applicant. There's not much you can do about it. Whatever changes come out there will happen, but things like bar passage are now a much bigger deal. We work with a lot of people on the bar side with Barbary, and they have a product that helps people pass the bar. And so ultimately that's become a much more important thing to law schools. I think we'll probably see a surge of people into those courses down the line here. So just different things being valued one way or the other is going to change the outcomes.
Yeah, it's speculation, but I mean, I could actually see, given how much bar's a quarter of the ranking now, bar passage. If I'm a school and someone applied and I had the ability to ask them, have you done anything already in preparation for the bar? And they said yes. That's a huge feather in their cap all of a sudden. That wouldn't have even been a relevant question, say, a year or two ago. I could see somebody taking like a Barbary pre-L course solely as like a point of merit for these schools to be like, oh, and by the way, along with my GPA, along with my LSAT, I'm bar ready. I'm ahead of the game.
It'd be tough for them to be bar ready that early, but they could take something like law preview.
I'm bar targeted.
I am focused on those things.
I see the trackpad of me. But yeah, it changes a little bit of the dynamics, not only in how schools behave, but in how applicants, I think, should probably present themselves as well.
Yeah, I think that is more likely to show itself where a school says we need to get fast work on making sure that our bar number is sufficiently high enough. Maybe previously they weren't as worried about it. Now they become more focused on it. And who knows, maybe some schools will, start providing additional resources to their students right now, because we are in bar prep season. The next bar is coming up in July, and so bar season has started. You might see a few schools who immediately turn around and say, hey, we need assistance for our students, and doing something that's programmatic across the entire graduating class. So anyway, on that particular note, let's take a look at the winners and losers as we've kind of tabbed it from this year's rankings. And there were so many to pick from that we really narrowed it down. So there are some schools who certainly were winners and losers that we're not going to cover here. We're just going to cover maybe the most notable ones. And let's start with a winner.
I got to let you take the first one, man.
You have to.
Yeah, you got to do it.
This is my alma mater on the undergrad side, and that is Duke. Certainly the big winner in the T14, going up 6 spots to be tied for 5th.
7th.
So, no.
5th, 6th, and 7th is one of the 3 schools tied for 5th. Sorry.
Yeah, there are 3 schools tied for 5th, so now you have that new T7. But to jump up there with Penn and Harvard, I'm sure that there is a lot of celebration in Durham right now, and I'm glad to hear it. I'm a big Duke fan, obviously, from the undergrad side, but I really like the law school, and the folks there have always been really nice in terms of how they treat students. And so Duke, the first winner out of this, probably celebrating the most today. There might be some hangovers in Durham tomorrow.
There might be some hangovers in St. Helena tomorrow. Why you celebrate with them?
I'm taking the night off probably after this. Tomorrow night I'll be going out again. So this is probably a 1 or 2 drink night for me, max.
Well, I'm guessing somewhere else they're pouring drinks, and this is for the entirely opposite reason. Although, again, super tongue-in-cheek, almost like no one can see me doing air quotes on a podcast, but I am. The big, I'd say, loser in the top 8, 10, certainly top 14 it's got to be Harvard, again, where they have slid and slid and slid. For a while, they were, number 2, competing for 1. They have dropped from tied for 3rd last year, down another spot, basically, into a tie for 5th, which means, in theory, Harvard could be as low as 7th in the rankings right now.
Yeah. And I personally, I've said this, I think it's ridiculous, but this is the way it is now. Now Harvard shows up tied for 5th, and I'm like, okay, I'm not buying it. Another loser in this kind of group was Columbia dropping 4 spots, which I also find to be ridiculous. These schools that have traditionally had very stable positionings all of a sudden change. Again, it's because they changed the metrics. U.S. News isn't going to talk about that. They're just going to say, well, this is the rankings and how we value the schools and weighted them. I'm like, exactly how you did it. Absolutely useless. But still, we're talking about it.
It is a little bit of a silly thing, right? Where'd you go to law school? Columbia. Oh, you couldn't get into Duke? Like, that's such a strange conversation. But based solely on the rankings at this point, conversation actually makes a degree of sense.
You see, that's a classic kind of scenario you present right there. There is no scenario in which I would go to Columbia for law school. And it's not because I'm some kind of anti-Columbia person. I just don't want to live in New York City. Right. And that's a personal preference. I think you would probably be like, fine with it.
I'd say the exact same thing for Duke.
Yeah, you would never go to Durham. And I understand that because Durham, at least when I was there, was the armpit of North Carolina in some respects. And all the people at Duke just got mad, but it's much better now. But Durham is still not exactly like, it doesn't have the amenities. I'd much prefer a city like DC if we're really going to get down into that, or even LA over that. And speaking of LA, let's go to our next winner, which has got to be UCLA. Last year, they'd slipped from 14 to 15. Now they're back.
Mm-hmm.
So Shady's back into the top 14 here for UCLA, edging out Georgetown. They seem to have this competition with them that I'm sure Georgetown's irked by. So like these upstarts trying to get in. And of course, another
they're playing
school,
like musical chair, basically. Like it's just these two running circles around one seat.
And we'll get to another school that's in that vicinity in a second, but USC also has to be irked, at least partially, to see UCLA doing that well because of the traditional rivalry between those two. But of course, if you're going to have UCLA as the winner here, you got to have Georgetown as the loser on that side because they have swapped positions, and they keep doing this. This has happened more than a few times, and so UCLA wins this year, Georgetown loses. We'll have to see what happens next year. So who's the next set of winners, John?
Yeah, we got a pair here, both of whom jumped up to the same spot by slightly different amounts. And that's USC, who you just mentioned, and Minnesota. Both of these have jumped to number 16, so they're inching their way, creeping their way into that coveted top 14 range. USC jumped 4 spots from last year, from 20 to 16. Minnesota jumped 5 from 21 to 16.
Mm-hmm. Minnesota is a school that I track closely just because my family's from Minnesota, and my parents and sister both went to the undergrad at the University of Minnesota, so I'm thrilled to see them up to 16. And they've slowly moved out of the 20s, kind of like the mid 20s, low 20s, now into 16. USC's got to be thinking we jumped 4 spots and we still can't catch UCLA, who moves up. So I think they're like, all right, toast us. Curse UCLA in that. And of course, when you've got some people jumping into the kind of like the lower part of the T20 or so, you're going to have some dropping out. And those two schools are on the loser side, and that would be Washington University in St. Louis and Boston University. They dropped out of the teens, I think, in kind of a harsh manner because with Wash U, they think they dropped from 4 spots down to number 20, and they have traditionally been in that late teen spot and kind of considered like a really good school outside of the T14, kind of like that group of 4 or 5 that were in there. And certainly, with UCLA and so forth. And it's now like, wait a second, they're now down to number 20. And the last thing you want to think to yourself when you're at a school like that is the start of a long-term slide. Mm-hmm. I don't think so. There's no reason to suspect that's going to be the case. They are very well-respected school. Boston U has definite reason to be irritated because they dropped 10 spots from 17 to 27. One of the harsher drops that I would say has occurred here in the top 30 or so.
Yeah, let me give you the other reason that I bet they're more than unhappy is because right across town, Boston College did the exact opposite and gained 8 spots to now be their neighbor in the ranking.
Yeah.
So, yeah, last year Boston University was 17, Boston College was 37. I think that's right. This year, 27 for Boston University, 29 for Boston College. So Boston College has closed that gap largely through Boston University's failures. But man, if you're looking at crosstown rivals and you're thinking like we're way out ahead of these guys, you turn around and they're breathing down your neck all of a sudden.
Yeah, they're right on.
Just on, riding you like a backpack. So it's interesting to see, especially when you start to again think geographically about how these schools must kind of side-eye the ones down the street.
And they're competing. It used to be that some of these schools would be like, well, we're not really competing against them. They're a solid slice below us. Now, if students are looking just at these rankings, they might think, I don't know, it's 50-50 as to which one I would choose. And nobody wants to have to get into a new cat fight that they weren't ready for. And let's cover some big winners here, at least with schools jumping into the 20s. We mentioned UGA up 9 spots from 29 to 20. Wake up 14 spots from 36 to 22. And then Ohio State jumping from 30 to 22. They've all moved into that top 25 designation. And generally, these are schools that haven't really been up at this level before. So for them, it's more of a new thing that they're running across. And you've had some various, like UGA's had some high rankings before, but this returns them to kind of like that 20 to 22 range, which is really generally very desirable. Once you're in the T25, you're sitting in a pretty good spot from a recruitment standpoint.
Yeah, you're going to start to attract a slightly different caliber of applicant at that point, which is obviously the goal of all of these schools.
Yeah, let's talk about a loser that, bugs me a little bit. And it is the school that is physically closest to me from a law school standpoint. And that'd be UC Davis. They're the closest school to me. UC Berkeley is the second closest school. Berkeley, still T14, pretty stable school overall. Fine. The Davis ranking really irritates me because they dropped 23 spots from number 37 to number 60. And this is exactly the kind of point where I'm like, Davis is a long-standing school with pretty solid ranking. I know tons of students have gone there who have been excellent students. And to see this all of a sudden, 23 spots, this is a great example of this is ridiculous and arbitrary. I don't like to see it. I like Davis in general as a campus and a location, been there a number of times. And to see the law school have this kind of tumble just irks me because I know it's all fake.
Yeah, this is a perfect example of just how superficial, and we keep using the word arbitrary, but that's what it is. It's really just silly.
Well,
that's it's silly if you're a loser.
If it's a winner, you're celebrating.
Yeah. If you're
and that brings us actually to this brings us to the last two. And what we'll do is we'll look at the biggest overall winners and the biggest overall losers. And then that'll close us out here. And again, this is just lighthearted fun for us to kind of poke around at something that we don't really have a whole lot of belief in, but is something that everybody talks about and ultimately becomes something that people rely upon. So the biggest winners in this year's rankings all jumped over 30 spots. And I will point something out, John. There are 5 schools in this group that jumped anywhere from 34 to 40 spots. Last year, there was just one school that jumped over 30 spots. Last year, Montana jumped 31 spots. The second largest jump last year was San Diego, up 22 spots. This year, we have 5 schools that jumped 34 or more spaces. This is a perfect crystallization of the volatility that we're talking about. So Oklahoma is one of the big winners. Last year, they dropped 21 spots to 88th position. Well, this year, they rocketed back up 37 spots to number 51. And it's like, wait a second. Are you trying to tell me they went from 67 to 88 to 51, and this is a viable ranking system? Did this school change that much in and of themselves and comparatively? Absolutely not. But that's what we get here.
I mean, that's an Oklahoma rodeo is what that is. Just up and down Bucks and Bronx. And how do you move that much year to year? And then don't justify that your system is legitimate.
You don't. I will let you close out the remaining of the winners here because there's several more.
Yeah, a couple of other schools through here. I'm going to go quick because people can check these on their own. We've just condensed them for you. Up 38 spots, a huge jump from nearly out of the top 100 to number 60 is FIU. T-Tech, I assume, is Texas Tech. Is that right, Dave? Yeah, okay. They're up 34 spots to number 71. So again, if you do that math, they've gone from 105 into the 70s. Massive gains. Marquette's up 34 as well, also tied for number 71, so just like Tech. And then I'm going to butcher this name. It's either Duquesne or Duquesne. Someone can write.
Duquesne, my friend.
Duquesne, so I got it right the first time.
The Dukes.
Like Andy Dufresne. Up 40 spots. That's how I'll remember it from now on. Up 40 spots to number 89. So we saw a lot of these schools that were either hovering around the 100 or even kind of deep into it, like Duquesne, that have now actually started to make some headway into what become, I don't want to necessarily say highly competitive numbers like a number 89, but they at least start to catch people's attention as they continue to climb up the ladder here. So that's what's interesting, that a school could jump 40 points, leaves this whole thing as kind of a free-for-all, man. It feels a little Wild West to me.
Duquesne, Pittsburgh represent there. When you look at something like that, what happens though is, you've gone, you're 89 now. Mm-hmm. Now all of a sudden a school, you're looking at schools and maybe you've applied to a sweep of schools and you've got 89 or 106. And suddenly someone might say to themselves, well, 89 is much better than 106, so I'm going to go that direction. People will make decisions off of this. And part of the message that we're trying to convey is this is really soft ground. This is maybe the worst year to use something like this to make school decisions because it could be entirely different next year. But those are some big jumps. You see some Texas schools really rocketing up. Texas A&M and Texas Tech, both really moving up. And so it's getting, competitive in the state of Texas at this point. And now let's talk about the biggest losers. Now, last year, John, I will tell you that the two biggest drops last year were 21 spots. One of those was Oklahoma, we talked about. And so those were the two biggest ones. All these drops are over 30 spots, up to 44 spots, and there are 6 of them, and that shows you the difference. Last year, we didn't even have any schools move more than 25 places. Here, we've got 6 moving 30 to 40 spots. And again, I know we're beating the horse at this particular point. This tells you so much about the way this is really hard to rely upon. Yeah. So Penn State, the Dickinson branch, down 31. That's terrible. Penn State's put some money into those schools for a while here. They'd seen some nice gains. This goes down to 89 now. University of St. Thomas down 31 to number 96. SUNY Buffalo, so New York school, down 31 to 125. Drops out of the top 100. Nobody likes that. Hawaii Manoa, which I always have a soft spot because I like Hawaii. If I were ever to go to law school, John, Hawaii might actually creep into the list of consideration. It has nothing to do with the law school. It has everything to do with the location.
I can see that, yeah.
Love Hawaii. Down 44 spots. They are the biggest dropping school of them all to 135. So also dropping out of 100. DePaul, in Chicago, down 30 spots to 135, which just seems hard for me. Like DePaul is a school that I've been fairly familiar with, especially on the undergrad side. It's hard for me to think of their law schools being ranked 135. And then finally, the University of Maine Law School, down 32 spots to 146. Those are all big drops. The people at those schools today cannot be thrilled. And of course, they've had some advance notice, so it's not as if when the rankings came out, this was their first time seeing them. Many schools had the opportunity to know where they were already, and they've had time to absorb this, but there's not much they can do at this point. It is now official.
It is now official. And again, air quotes that people can't see me doing. As official as it's going to get, at least. And I hope that's what people take away from this, is that, look, there's value to understanding how this works. There's certainly value to knowing how to prioritize schools based on ranking. To me, the biggest value, and I mentioned this in the episode last year, I'll say it again, is that what these rankings do provide is a lot of granular detail about the schools themselves. So, for instance, you'll actually get to see school bar passage rates. You can see LSAT medians. You can see GPA medians and how they change and move over time. You can estimate your chances. You can see things like, well, just how many librarians do they have? Very important types of stats. But that, to me, is where the most value in these rankings are. It's not the actual outcome number. It's in the details that are used to compute the number, because those details are ultimately what's going to determine how it is that you experience that school and how successful or unsuccessful you find yourself there.
That's exactly right. It brings all this data into one spot.
Right.
All this is, largely publicly available with, employment, bar passage, and all these things. But here it does bring it in. It gives you an opportunity to look at it, and it gives you one person's take on this. And the word that I would probably use to characterize all of this is fluid. Very changeable. Changed so much this year. There is a theory being floated right now that next year's rankings will be considerably different because they're going to have to change their methodology, kind of like in large measure next year. So I don't know if that's going to happen. I'm not going to worry about next year's rankings until next year, but this is what we have this year. I'm sure there'll be a lot of conversation about it. And I know at some point I'll get a question that says, well, now that the school's dropped 20 places, I'm not sure I want to go there anymore. And I'm like, what changed about the school? Mm-hmm. Anything? And they could go up 20 places next year. Make the decision based on what's best for you, what's the best fit, what's the best financials, the school you feel most comfortable at, the school that you think you could be the most successful at. Don't make it based upon the rankings here, because that will not play out to your benefit in the long term.
Yeah, well, there you go.
John?
I cannot add a thing more to that. I'm surprised we had as much to say as we did, so go us.
A lot of it was complaining about U.S. news. Anyway, on that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else that you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, leave us a comment and a rating as well. And if you have questions for an upcoming mailbag episode, please send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of John and myself, we hope that you've enjoyed our lighthearted look at the terrible U.S. news rankings. We hope you stay safe out there, and we will talk to you again soon. Thanks.